Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 102. Now, we have been discussing events that are taking place in Europe around the 17th century, early to mid 17th century. We've discussed absolutism, we've discussed the 30 Years' War, and we've also talked about the English Civil War and the Fronde that happened in France. And the ending with France is a perfect beginning for this lecture because we're staying in France. And now we're focusing on the age of Louis XIV. Now, we already know that Louis XIV had an interesting childhood. And because of his childhood, Louis XIV distrusted, very suspicious of the aristocracy or the nobility in France resulting from the Fronde, the rebellion that had taken place when he was a small boy. So we already know that, when he eventually becomes king of France, which he will, he takes over direct control around the mid-17th century. He was 23 by the time. Can you imagine a 23-year-old in charge of a whole country? Even if you're 23, it's mind-boggling. And he'll actually rule for over half a century. So he is in charge of France for quite a long time. So it's interesting that we'll find out from Mr. Eliot in this age of Louis XIV how he will make sure the aristocracy in France, or the nobility, is contained. He has very interesting methods of keeping the aristocracy from being a problem for him. Because if you do have a rebellion or a civil war in your own country, it takes money. So it's going to take the aristocracy or some kind of backing of someone with some capital to get supplies, etc., to have a sustained civil war rebellion. And Louis XIV wants to make sure this doesn't happen to him. You may have heard of the very opulent and famous Palace of Versailles. He will use this Palace of Versailles to keep these aristocrats in check, and we'll find out how he does that from Mr. Eliot. And he also will make sure that important government positions in France are not filled with the aristocracy or the nobility. He makes sure that he gives any kind of important government position to the bourgeoisie or the middle class because, of course, they can be controlled a lot easier than the aristocracy can. In fact, other monarchs throughout Europe will use Louis XIV's example in their own countries or kingdoms of trying to keep the aristocracy in check. Definitely an absolutist ruler. He is very, very powerful. He's known as the Sun King, and you'll hear more about that as well in this upcoming lecture on Louis XIV. So many things take place during the age of Louis XIV in France, and of course in all of Europe. There will also still be some residual problems dealing with religion in France. Now, you've already learned about Henry IV, or Henry of Navarre. He was the Bourbon king who was a Protestant when he came to the throne, but converts to Catholicism. But he issues the Edict of Nantes to grant toleration to Protestants, lets them worship in their private, castles, etc., so that the religious fighting in France will taper off. The tension eases under Henry. Well, we still have, religious problems, of course, and under Louis XIV, there is a revocation or a taking away of the Edict of Nantes. And there was destruction of those Huguenot or Protestant churches, closing of Protestant schools that resulted. And a lot of Protestant families under Louis XIV will flee into another country in Europe called Prussia. Now, a lot of these Protestant families were very much professionals, skilled. They contributed to society. They were a very strong middle class. So what France lost, Prussia gained because of this revocation of the Edict of Nantes. So we're still having that issue, of course, with religion. You would think it would be finished by now, but obviously not. It continues on even into the age of Louis XIV. And there will be some persecutions occurring in France as well. Also, you've heard of the Habsburgs. It's that dynasty. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, was a Habsburg. Louis XIV is a Bourbon. He will marry into the Habsburg family. And the Habsburgs are traditionally Catholic in nature. Bourbons, of course, traditionally Protestant, but, you know, Henry, that first Bourbon to become king, had converted to Catholicism. So Louis XIV will actually marry a Habsburg. Her name was Maria Theresa. She was from Austria. Not altogether too popular, by the way. Now, he had a very, very excellent finance minister in the beginning of his reign. The finance minister, I'm sure you probably hear more about him, but his name was Colbert. And Colbert did a great job of guiding Louis XIV. In fact, the French economy under Colbert was very solid. But Colbert will not live forever. And when Colbert dies, so does some of his reasoning. Because in the second half of Louis XIV's reign, as you'll learn more about, Louis becomes involved in a lot of wars that are taking place. And you know that war costs money. And this will not be good for France. Louis takes over. France is powerful. It's respected. European monarchs are emulating and copying Louis XIV. Toward the second half of his reign, we start seeing France involved in not one, but quite a few wars throughout Europe that you'll, of course, hear about more with Mr. Eliot. War of the Spanish Succession is one, just to give you one example. Louis was hoping to put a member of the Bourbon dynasty on the throne of Spain. Doesn't work, of course, as you'll find out, but he tries to do so. So the second half of Louis XIV's reign, not quite as glorious as the first. Colbert died, and Louis gets involved in a lot of costly warfare. He didn't have Colbert sitting on his shoulder whispering, you don't need to do that, you don't need to do that. And he also became involved in, with a lady, her name was Madame de Maintenon, that will influence his religious philosophy. She was very much a devout Catholic. And now, she could not marry him and become queen because of her status. She wasn't high enough up in the ranks to actually become his queen. But she couldn't marry him openly. But she definitely became an influence on him later on. All right. Now, of course, Louis XIV eventually dies. 1715 is when he died. And on his deathbed, his grandson will become the next heir, the next ruler, I guess, to the French throne. But his grandson's only like 5 years old. So France is in for a rough ride after the age of Louis XIV. So let's find out a little bit more about Louis XIV and his government and France itself.
Many, if not most, American students, consciously or unconsciously, are driven to some knowledge and much opinion of Louis XIV through the popular culture and through our political certainty. Readers are presented with a particular interpretations and peculiar images of the famous and infamous king. In the novels of Andre Dumas, particularly The Three Musketeers, published in 1844, and its sequel 10 years after, which was published 3 years later, and by their various film adaptations. especially the 1998 movie Man in the Iron Mask starring Leo DiCaprio as the imaginary royal twins, the handsome good guy Philippe and his slightly older, definitely and charmingly evil bad guy brother Louis XIV. While this novel and movie plots do have some vague basis in history and truth, matters of succession always plague the French royals, and many of us have double personalities. This literature and cinematic schizophrenia effectively, if deceptively, presents the Louis and the France most of us assume that we know and presume to incorporate in our historical literacy. And imagine Louis XIV is most often who we see and what we get. And what we get in history is a pronounced bias. One of the greatest challenges of History 102 is to at least try to put aside what we think we know about Louis XIV and then reconsider the king on his own terms and that of his age. Now, we come to all this difficulty honestly. Louis XIV remains, after all, the most renowned king of France and really the most renowned king of anywhere else and anywhen else. But it's not completely that he's Louis, but that he's French. That qualifies or disqualifies our consensus understanding of 17th and 18th century Europe. For most American, Louis's Gallic reality puts Louis XIV on the wrong side of history. And for most of our history, and for most of our present, we evidence a sort of a bias toward England and against France. And if it's against France, it's against the French, and by extension, against Louis XIV. Our national and our cultural heritage is based on the legacy of our English language, English institutions, English traditions, English conventions, English literature, English civilization. We see the world through a predominantly Anglo and Anglo-American perspective. English history is our foundation. English likes and dislikes are the part and parcel of our own. And we generally have the same historical friends and foes as do the English. And that's what helps keep us Anglophilic. We like the English, and rather Franco-phobic, we dislike the French. For most American students, French history usually begins at the 100 Years' War, 1337, the 1453, if you remember History 101. But it's a history as presented usually by the Shakespeare plays, particularly Henry V, which was written in 1599. The famous lines, once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, and close the wall up with our English dead. Well, Shakespeare wrote and reads with an English national bias, a sort of a patriotic sentiment. And since England is fighting France and Henry V, the French are the bad guys. And they continue to be so down the years in our own literature, history, fact, and mostly opinion. After the Reformation, France remains predominantly Catholic, while England devolves or evolves, depending on how you view this, into a Protestant power. And this adds religious diversity and divergence and rivalry to the ongoing dynastic and national antagonisms. And since the United States is primarily a Protestant republic, we have a sort of an inclusive anti-Catholic bias in America. After 1492, when the French and the English take their European quarrels over the ocean, the French remain the bad guys to the English settlers and settlements in a New England. It's the French out of New France, out of Canada, who aid and abet the First Nations of a Native American Indian America in their savage response to English settlement, English invasion, and English colonization. We usually style the North American frontier component of 18th century warfare as the French and Indian War, and we link our two traditional American enemies in a war won by the English and lost by the French. Although France is aiding and abetting of the 13 revolting colonies, will prove perhaps that France is really the chief determining factor in the waging and winning of the War of American Independence, and the fact that France conveniently sells the vast mid-continental territory, the heartland of North America, to the young United States through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. And that France has been our ally in World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. Many in the States profess or pretend to hate the French. Perhaps our Anglo-American history and heritage makes us so. And our English history is probably the mother of our French dislike. Or might it be the politics? Now, this is kind of odd, since we all have this idea that the Founding Fathers drew extensively on French political theory for American political thought. And well, we got to go back beyond the Revolution, really back to the evening and dawn of English settlement in North America to appreciate our French-phobic discontent. As Americans, we come from an English political tradition that's evolved over time. It's one that rejects royal power, centralized authority, and autocratic might makes right, this majestical rule. And we embrace instead these Republican virtues of smaller, less empowered, more representative government of checks and balances. We eventually arrive and pretty much stay with Mr. Jefferson's, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, which means at the time, no kings, no sirs, no nobles, no aristocrats. And we rather subconsciously choose liberty over a perceived royal tyranny of absolutism. After all, we drove the English kings, the lords and sirs out of our portion of the continent. In our revolution, we reject the bloody excesses of the French as they drove theirs away. We reject the Bonapartes that followed the Bourbon kings into power and in ruin. And we tend to dismiss French royal institutions as out of date and out of step to our values. And we sort of double down them as aristocratic and anachronistic failures, suitable only for the dustbins of history. There are no kings in America, so all kings must be bad, particularly French kings. So the certainty of our political success is the stepmother of our opinion against the French. There's also this cultural divide which separates France and America by distances greater than leagues, miles, and oceans. Some stateside moderns see the French as slightly amusing, distasteful, or even a contemptible people. They're the ones who eat snails too much, don't bathe very often, are a little too formal and effeminate, effete, and way too rude. We see them as rather consistent surrender monkeys who are always dropping their guns and raising their hands to surrender to their victorious enemies. We also see them as rather inconsistent in their appreciation of the United States, who saved them for two very real enemies in World War I and II. There's a recent political factor here. The French disinclination to join George W. Bush's war in Iraq or participate in his, against his axis of evil sparked a general, popular, and American disdain for French policy in particular and for the French in general. Even in South Louisiana, with a very, very deep and abiding pervasive French heritage, some cars boasted a paper bumper sticker sentiment, "Bomb the French." Now, these instincts and inclinations of French phobia, like freedom fries, might have little to do with reality and everything to do with our perception of Louis XIV, but almost nothing to do with the actuality of Louis and his France. Certainly, Louis and the French ate snails. They didn't bathe very often, but that was a worldwide convention carried everywhere into force except in Japan. They do appear overly formal and a bit effeminate due to social conventions and fashion dictates. But to imagine the French of Louis XIV's time, or before or after, as I guess those flag-waving, white flag-waving cowards who are always ready to surrender, is a certifiable falsehood and evidences a willful ignorance of military history. Now, to misperceive Louis XIV is to misunderstand French, European, American, and world history. To correctly perceive the age of Louis XIV for History 102 requires that we reconsider the signature king and his country within the content and context of Louis XIV himself. And that remains a challenge, not only from our questionable perception of Louis and the French, but because of the complexity of the age of Louis XIV. It's so complex, lots of times it makes modern students want to act out the opening lines of that famous Kingsman song from the 1960s, Louie Louie. It's the greatest rock and roll song ever written. You might be familiar with it from the movie Animal House. There's a real good version up on YouTube. You need to listen to that. Well, the first verse of Louie Louie goes, and I won't sing it, a Louie Louie, oh no, say me gotta go. In other words, you close the book, you give it up, it's too complex, you step away from Louis XIV and his Europe. But that's not what we're going to do here in 102. It's going to be Louie Louie, we got to go. Got to go back to the age of Louis XIV and back in time and place for History 102. So here goes. Proverbially, the child is father to the man. And we need to consider Louis's biography as a man, as a king, and as an image. We might want to first think our way through French history up to the time of Louis XIV to place him and his in the proper perspective. And to do that, we first have to start with geography. Now, if you can imagine a globe or a map, that would fix your image of France is in the northwest corner of Europe, with a face looking not just across the English Channel, but also across the Atlantic Ocean. It also has its underbelly on the Mediterranean Sea. Now, with these watery boundaries to the west and south, by fronting two seas, the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, France is a regional maritime power at the center of the European world. On the European continent, some mountain barriers to the southwest and east separate France from her neighbors Spain and Italy. But her northern and eastern boundaries, with the various German states, were and are forested and farmlands. This is a geography made for war. Now, France has this long history of human occupation, all the way from a very extensive prehistoric presence, prehistoric civilization, stretching over a fabulous Stone Age culture with all those wonderful Stone Age cave art that I talked about and maybe you saw in History 101. Now, it goes from this prehistoric period right into this very rich, very warlike Celtic warrior culture, well described in Caesar's The Conquest of Gaul. Now, Gaul was conquered, it was subdued, it was occupied by Imperial Rome, but it was civilized too and Christianized very early. France was certainly invaded by all sorts of Germanic and Nordic peoples, but she remained much of her Gallic and her Romano-Gallic sensibilities, pride, and identity. From a general northern stronghold that becomes Paris, kings in France became kings of France by presence, persistence, patience, and power. But if we follow the English historical themes, we usually perceive France losing the Hundred Years' War. After all, the English went at Crécy and Agincourt. They burned up Joan of Arc into a crispy critter. But France and her kings managed to hold on. While France loses the battles, she always seems to win the war. She remains intact. She remains growing. Now, there are extensive French wars of religion to consider, where faith and atrocity emerge from both sides. It's settled somewhat by the famous Treaty of Nantes of 1599, the Edict of Nantes, we usually call it, which awards Protestants certain rights in overwhelmingly Catholic France. But if English kings start losing royal rights from the Magna Carta onward, French kings keep, cultivate, and expand their power. England decentralizes, France centralizes power in her kings. These kings and their royal ministers mostly and somewhat kind of perhaps keep France out of the worst excesses of the 30 Years' War, which humbles and devastates the German states. But there are complicated internal struggles and conflicts that occupy France until Louis XIV assumes personal rule in 1643. And at this point, we turn from an oversimplified historical geography to maybe a fairly complex historical biography. Louis is born on September 5th of 1638. Louis XIV is a Virgo, but he's born on an unusual sign of parental association. His parents, Anne of Austria and Louis XIII of France, had been married for over 20 years with not much evidence of conjugal duty or bliss. Anne of Austria was a Spanish-born Habsburg princess. She married Louis XIII at 14 as part of an alliance guarantee between Spain and France. But she had produced no heir throughout their long years of marriage. Anne was attractive, but her husband was uninterested in her and in women generally. Her royal husband, Louis XIII, became king at 8 when his father, Henry IV, was assassinated. Now, Henri IV converts to Catholicism, the famous Paris is worth a mass quote. He issues the Edict of Nantes, but he's murdered in 1610, and his young heir, Louis XIII, is really too young, too inexperienced to be the actual king. So France would be ruled by Henry IV's wife and widow, Louis XIII's mother, Marie de Medici. Now, as a Medici, she's rich, she's beautiful, she's cultured, she's willful, she's vain, she's extravagant, and she's very powerful. She loves pomp and ceremony and conspiracy. Much of her grandson Louis XIV's good traits may be traced back to his Italian grandmother, his Medici grandmother. But Marie didn't think too highly of her son, Louis XIII. As regent, she simply ignored him and ruled rather haphazardly through a series of unpopular ministers. Uncertainty and ineptness brought out the worst in family rivalry during her regency in the early reign of Louis XIII. But for all practical purposes, the Queen Mother Marie remained in power, surviving many revolts and uprisings, and sponsoring revolts and uprisings herself against her own son and king. By 1617, Louis XIII came of age, and he became really the king in and of France. He overruled much, if not all, of his mother's alliances and policies, and finally just exiled her, gone, out of sight, out of mind. She escaped and revolted again, but her son's interests were produced and protected by a new minister and eventual Cardinal Richelieu and his new wife, Anne of Austria. Marie was exiled again, where she continued to conspire against Louis XIII. Now, having such a ferocious and dangerous mother certainly must have influenced Louis XIII's attitudes against women and conspiring women, certainly. And you combine this with his general interest in nearly all women, with a possible tendency to depression, with the probable inclination to homosexuality and impotency, with the certainty of ill health. It should come as no surprise that two young royals, Anne and Louis XIII, had no children for some time. Now, we need to be careful in dismissing Louis XIII as not much of a good king. He was martial. He expanded France's army, her navy, her territory, and encouraged a worldwide colonial exploration. But he left much of the ruling of France, the everyday rule of France, to Cardinal Richelieu, who may or may not have become Anne's lover. Louis XIII always had to keep a very, very close eye on dangerous rivals, his cousins, his uncles, his brother, and of course, his mother. Louis XIII was certainly not a very good husband, and the royals were often apart by circumstances and by mutual consent or Louis XIII's disinterest. Only a chance sharing of a bed, the only bed left over in a royal move, and a fortunate rainstorm put the two together and produced a son, our Louis XIV, in 1638. And Louis XIII was awful suspicious of his paternity, wondered who the baby daddy really was. Father and son were not close, and they never were close. Now, because of Louis XIV, we use it to dispense 13 as an unattractive non-entity. And popular history treats him kind of badly, but probably rather fairly. And most of what we remember him for is for dying in 1643 and making way for his famous son. Now, on his father's death, Louis the Dauphin, which means the heir, officially became Louis XIV when he's only 5 years old. His ascension was almost instantly celebrated by the occasion of a spectacular victory over the Habsburg rivals in the famous Battle of Rocroi. Louis XIV, as an infant, as a child, got his first real taste of royal glory, but he did not rule. His mother did. Anne seized power and became the regent and ruling through a series of unpopular, if able, ministers, particularly the eventual successor to Richelieu and cardinal in his own right, Mazarin. Now, Mazarin, who may or may not have been the Queen's regent's lover, was a very, very competent man. Mazarin successfully negotiated the wonderfully efficient Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which formally ended the 30 Years' War. France's reward for this treaty was that she got considerable concessions in land from Austria. She grew the size of her kingdom, and she took on a role as the deal maker and power breaker in Europe. Initially, there was little time for rejoicing, though, because almost immediately France erupted in this terrible, terrible civil war. And we call this the Fronde, which is named from the word for slingshot, was the weapon of choice used by some of the rebels in the Civil War insurrection. But it's kind of hard to call them rebels. A lot of the people involved were ex-soldiers who were unhappy by the peace and unemployment at the end of the 30 Years' War. All sorts of people who had been set adrift by the course of the war. All sorts of folks were unhappy by Mazarin's prosecution of the war, especially by his enhanced taxes, his reduction of certain autocratic, aristocratic, and urban feudal privileges, and his expansion of the royal power at the expense of those aristocratic and urban Frenchmen. After about 3 years of constant rebellion and rioting, there was a attempt to discredit all the rebellion rioting, which, while terrifying the young and new king and angering Louis XIV and his people. You could argue that this demonstration against royal authority, the Fronde, sparked a massive increase in royal power and prerogative and helps make Louis Louis. And that sort of partially formats Louis's absolutism as a response to the Fronde, which is usually the basis of how we make an assessment of the age of Louis XIV. Soon this rebellion involved all sorts and all manners of Louis's near and far relations and possible rival claimants, and so the Fronde evolves into a war against Louis's throne. Princes less loyal than they should and less royal than Louis began to intrigue against their king, intrigue against his ministers, intrigue against their rivals, his rivals, and each other. Just about everybody intrigued against everybody else. Though the Fronde did bring into prominence and suspicion perhaps the two greatest soldiers of the age, Condé and Turenne, as rebels, at least initially. And Condé and Turenne will write large the military history of Europe at this time. Now, Spain's entry under one side of certain Fronders alarmed the French peasantry, who rose up in defense of their king. Battles were fought, they were won, they were lost. Commanders changed sides back and forth. People betrayed Louis, and some asked his pardon. Pretty soon the rebellion just simply fizzled out, and Mazarin went in and out of exile. France stalled and staggered under ruin and anarchy. Turenne switched sides and all of a sudden was supporting the king, while Condé stayed rebellious and fought for Spain, fought for the rebels, fought for himself, fought against Louis. Now, Paris supported the Fronde, and which earned the king's eternal distaste, dislike, and wrath. Mazarin went in and out of exile again like a piece of toast, popping up and down all the time. Spain and Royal France began to campaign against each other all along their shared border. And it's when France began confronting an external threat, this external threat of foreign armies, that France realized we're suffering to no end and no really good here. We're sliding into ruin, and they begin to turn toward the king as their only source of salvation and peace. In 1658, in June, Condé lost the Battle of the Dunes to the now Louis-loyal Turenne. In November of 1659, all parties signed the Peace of the Pyrenees, with Condé formally forgiven by Louis in early 1660. Now, the Fronde helps make Louis Louis and an absolutist. When the rebellion first opened, back when it first got off the ground, the Parisian mob burst into the royal palaces, entered the young king's bedchamber with a threatening menace. Louis pretended to be asleep. He hid in his bed. And once they finally left, he got up and escaped. And he escaped under very trying conditions. He was terrified. He lived meager. He did without. And he always disliked and avoided Paris from this moment on. For the rest of his life, he couldn't stand the rebellion, the disorder, the anarchy. He never believed the pretension that folks were fighting the Fronde against his ministers, against his mother, and for him. He vowed never to be so powerless. Powerless before the mob, powerless before the rebels, powerless before the aristocrats, powerless before his mother, powerless before his ministers. Never be powerless again, like some French Scarlett O'Hara. I'll never be powerless again. In 1661, Mazarin dies, and Louis assumes personal command of France, personal ruler now, and begins to reform France with his eyes to his power and on French security. He summed up the situation succinctly saying, disorder rules everything. And he turned his attention to reorganize his ruined kingdom. Now, Nicolas Fouquet had been directing royal finances during the early days of the Fronde and the early days of Louis's personal power. Now, Fouquet was this financial genius, and he found ways to restore the royal bankruptcy, the national debt, and arrange credit for the king's private and personal expenses. He essentially refloated France from all this financial ruin brought on by the wars and rebellions. Wars breed corruption, but so does a post-war peace. And while reorganizing and reforming public and private royal finance, Fouquet worked wonders. But power corrupts, and absolute financial power corrupts absolutely. Money flowed through Foucault's hands, flowed because of Foucault's hands, but they always seemed to stick to his fingers. Ability, ambition, avarice, and appearance would become his downfall. Invited by Fouquet to see the minister's new established estate, Louis began to measure the buildings, the splendor of the chateau, the gardens, the art, all the splendid things that Foucault had, and he saw red. He saw the red ink of French finances, that no matter what Foucault was doing, France was always bleeding money. But Louis also went green. He went green with envy, because he saw Foucault's establishment was of such a grand scale in nature, had such a public face and private taste, that it was more lush and luxurious than anything Louis XIV had himself. Louis saw Foucault as a rival, and after the Regency and the Fronde, there could be no rivals. There could be no king. There could be no first Frenchman other than Louis XIV. 20-something Louis had Foucault investigated, arrested by D'Artagnan, the Three Musketeers fame no less, tried, convicted, and imprisoned. All of Foucault's wealth, properties, possessions were seized by the king and became Louis'. Jean-Baptiste Colbert replaced Fouquet, proving more able, more loyal, more humble, more self-effacing, less sticky-fingered, and more capable of getting blood out of the turnip of French finances. With Colbert's help, Louis XIV restarted his personal reign with massive reforms to royal, private, and public France. The goals were pretty simple. Make Louis XIV the most fabulous king ever. Make France the most splendid kingdom ever. Make Louis' France the new Rome. And by and large, he was successful. Now, they did so by building on France's strengths and by compensating for France's weaknesses. And they did this along lines of three ongoing initiatives: taxation, mercantilism, and presentation. Taxation, mercantilism, and presentation. Now, for all the tragedy and all the ruin of France's invasions and insurrections, Louis's kingdom was an awakening giant. France had the largest population of all the European states. She had a very, very fertile soil. She could feed her people, usually. She had tremendous natural resources. She had considerable industrial and commercial power. She had two coasts, open to the Atlantic and to the Mediterranean, which gave her the possibilities of trade, and she had innumerable rivers that were all navigable inside France. You could move in and out of France with some ease. Colbert had this uncanny ability at taxation. He could raise royal state revenue on just about anything and everything. He could do it efficiently, effectively, and he did it ruthlessly. He produced money for Louis. He developed and refined a particular economic theory and practice called mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is designed to produce state power and prosperity by fostering self-sufficiency, by practicing a wise economy, and by increasing the influx of gold and silver through a luxury trade. It fosters self-sufficiency, it practices a wise economy, it increases the influx of gold and silver through a luxury trade. The king, through Colbert's reforms, encouraged French commerce and industry. Created a French naval presence capable of rivaling Spain, the first and foremost naval power of the time. And the Navy means trade, it means security, and trade and security means power. France tried to produce as much, if not all, of what she needed in France itself. Didn't want to send her wealth out and fund and fuel her neighbors, her rivals, or her enemies. Now, Colbert advised Louis to spend only when spending was absolutely necessary. Spend no more or no less than you need to spend. Now, this is not being miserly, but carefully frugal. And Louis would be at turns tight-fisted with a sou or lavish with a livre. Unproverbially, Louis was penny-wise and pound-wise, and foolish with neither small nor large amounts of money. Now, this quality of a wise economy did not disqualify that third initiative of presentation. And this is a private presentation, a public presentation, and a royal presentation we're talking about here. And they all would commingle in particular images of France generally and of Louis XIV specifically. Now, because France appears in American history with La Salle's claim to Louisiana in 1682, most Americans view images of Louis XIV when they were relatively middle-aged man in his 40s. But in the 1660s, Louis was the 20-something young king. He was this bright and shining new monarch, more in the Leo DiCaprio tradition than you might imagine. And Louis would use all his considerable looks, abilities, charms, powers, and position to present a most attractive public, private, and royal presence. Now, private presentation might start with Louis XIV, but it did not end there. Private presentation also refers to private possessions, to the material objects that came to define the good life in France as simply the good French life. This is one of quality and luxury that anybody could obtain by simply buying French stuff. And France worked hard at this, and she achieved a marvelous ability to produce fashionable objects, luxury goods, such as tapestries, porcelains, silks, jewelry, clothes, hats, crockery, and also the gem crackery that showed the world that you were a person of taste and refinement simply because you had them. Now, many of these French manufactured items were touted as just as owned by Louis XIV. They were pitched to connect the king with what you could buy. And pretty soon, French market supply was totally overwhelmed by French and European market demand. You could be as cool as the French by buying whatever they were selling. Kind of the branding of Europe, it was a French brand. You bought the right things, you bought the French things. Louis' France set the standard for the best and the brightest of everything material. People across Europe aspired to look like, live like, and be like the French. And with everybody high and low, openly and enthusiastically imitating French ways and means, French styles and fashions, the French and their king achieved unprecedented influence and presence in Europe. Now, when Louis refurbished his France, and sometimes he did this in a conscious but secret homage to what the grace and grandeur of the unfortunate Fouquet, Louis was encouraging a particular image of France, an image of his France. Now, nowhere do we see so lavish a presentation or so successful accomplishment as we do in the progressive expansions of certain royal residences, especially Versailles. Now, palaces normally house the king and his court, but this former hunting lodge at Versailles, which was far enough away from Paris for privacy and protection to suppress any bad memories or bad dreams of the horrible Fronde, Louis had this transformed as a built presentation that burnished the image of the king as this young and gracious majesty. It gave him this luxurious sheen where he glowed like a new young sun king. Now, not only would this become the premier royal residence, but Versailles also served a greater purpose. European royalty were imitating Louis' architecture at Versailles, as well as copying all the French fashion, cultural artifacts that everyone else did. But Louis required that Versailles do something else. He required that it be the place where all the aristocrats would gather. And the presence of all French aristocrats at Versailles meant that they lived, they loved, they pranced, and they danced under the careful scrutiny of the king. Now, not only did this bind in the often difficult and very diffident blue bloods into a more personal and therefore a more dependent relationship with the court and the king, but some of these aristocrats came from the very families and regions that had participated on the other side, the bad side, the rebellious side of the throne, and Louis could watch these folks. And so what Versailles becomes is this golden cage to monitor and defang the aristocratic and close tradition, minor or major, royal kith and kin, all those rivals, all those enemies who did and could threaten Louis' power. Versailles became the nerve center of Louis' agency to increase and control, expand, and protect his power as king. Versailles also became a national and international showcase, used to dazzle Louis's family, his folks, his friends, his allies, his enemies, of exactly how grand and accomplished Louis' France really is. Foreign princes and ambassadors, generals, could arrive at Versailles and view the rising sun power of the new king. Versailles demonstrated that France would, could, and did do tremendous things, these vast constructions of palaces, offices, gardens, and fountains. By its very design, Versailles demonstrated that the French could control nature. They did this formalized garden, formalized layout as a symbol of French control and the glory of the king and his power. This immense scale, this superb design, this very well-handled execution of Versailles awed anybody and everybody. If you arrived, if you gawked, if you visited, if you stayed, if you lingered at Versailles, you were always under the eye of the king and always within this perfect world, this impressive world that Louis had constructed. Now, public presentation was not limited to architecture or to landscape. Louis cultivated all manner of things to demonstrate his power and his prestige, to complement the excellence of his kingdom. After imprisoning Fouquet, Louis adopted Fouquet's gardener, André Lenotre, his painter, Charles Lebrun, and his architect, Louis Laveau, and built this remarkable trinity of accomplishments into a broad-based stable of talent for his royal purposes and his royal services. Royal patronage graced all the arts and letters, French painting, French sculpture, French literature, French poetry, French music, French dance, French theater, all set the standards for civilized life in France and in Europe. Foreign commissions and purchases of art brought in revenue to France and raised the prestige of any and everything French. And soon everybody wanted to be French, wanted to be like the French, wanted to live like the French. French dancing, French fashion, French cooking, French feasting, French kissing, all became the rage of Europe. French as a language, the French language replaced Latin as the recognized and expected language of the most cultivated men. Even the hated and feared Paris and other regional locations were modified, improved, and enhanced to do this wonderful presentation of the quality of life in France. Nor were the sciences neglected, and not even the law. Again, France sets the standards in every field. Now, what Louis hungered for was glory. Glory through doing and glory through being. And his name and presence were soon stamped across everything and everywhere. Even Louisiana's favorite and famous Code Napoleon has its origins in an earlier Code Louis. It set legal standards, legal logic, and consistency across a Romanized Europe that was presto changeo, made into a Gallicized Europe, a French Europe, and who soon exported all their ideas of almost everything around the world, where they remain pretty much in place to this day. If imitation is the highest form of flattery, every other kingdom, even enemy states, were openly aping Louis and France's every move and gesture. Now, the young king was happy to build, to trade, to direct, and inspire, but simultaneous to all this cultural seduction, Louis's public presentations could take on a lethal quality as well. He was not hesitant to make war as well as love to the rest of Europe. And war, not horse racing, is the true sport of kings. And Louis could play hard, fast, and fatal with his soldiers and sailors. He could make war by necessity. The first duty of a state is always to protect itself, but he could also make war by choice. Louis had these definite ideas about the territorial borders of France, and sought, usually successfully, to extend France to nationally defendable borders at the expense of his Spanish, Italian, German, and Austrian neighbors, and against any internal independent fiefdoms that were within his France. Louis thought that if you spoke French, no matter what your national or ethnic background, you were French, and therefore you were his. And he would launch what he cheekily called wars of reunion to extend his borders to include more people, even if they were somebody else's folks. Now, he would delightfully increase his territories by treaty or alliance or purchase, but actively embrace military solutions for the use of his power by using his army. With the financial reform and aggressive taxation of Colbert, he could usually afford to do so, especially if he could supplement French funding with seizures and assessments of defeated enemies. But he used lavish gifts and loans to win friends and influence people as well. But it was the army that was the fang of his radiant, sunny smile. He had Europe's largest, best trained, best equipped, and best supplied standing army, and he was not shy to use it. It was officered by all those aristocrats defanged at Versailles and newly refanged for Louis's use. The army had its ranks drawn from this vast agricultural population. It was supplied and supported from strong and well-stocked fortifications designed geometrically by Vauban, who set the standards for European military engineering. French armies had this reputation for hard marching and stand-up fighting. And they did this all with a certain elan, a certain grace and charm, sort of a brave ability here. They fought, and they fought with style, win or lose. Some surrendered monkeys, the French. Now, we should not mistake Louis's fabrication of France as a fabrication of Louis's role in this fabrication. He was no front man, no royal talking head. Louis talked the talk and he walked the walk. He directed France's rise to power and prosperity personally. Louis was a hands-on king. As easily as the unmade men as Fouquet, he created a new French royal state by using the best and brightest people in France. Louis never said, "L'État c'est moi," his signature statement, "I am the state," but he could have, because France was of his own creation. And he reformed the French bureaucracy to serve him and France very well. He would surround himself with able ministers drawn into the royal service from the rising and better educated middle class, who saw the king as their protector and shield against the aristocrats who wanted to keep them down. Now, these new civil servants served the king personally, served France devotedly, and worked under Louis's close personal supervision as he directed the financial, the industrial, the commercial, and the military reform of France. Now, all this required great royal stamina and royal presentation with hand in hand with power. Louis lived a very, very personal life where every gesture, every act, every action was watched intently and for imitation and emulation. Louis lived in the glare of his own sunlight. There was little privacy and much self-sacrifice. Louis worked, played, prayed, lived, danced, ate, and bathed in the public eye. And where art imitates life and life imitates art, where everybody wanted to be French and Louis was France, he set the standard in full view. He had this commanding presence, and he was a pretty good actor. He had discerning taste, and he had undeniable ability. Beyond being king, he was a most attractive man. He was a fine athlete, a strong writer, a very, very exuberant dancer, and he was enough of a man and a king to be vain about it. He was cautious, but he had to be. He always lived in the spotlight where every gesture was watched very carefully, but he also lived within this family legacy of assassination, rivalry, and betrayal. Court life was formal for very, very good reasons of presentation and protection. Louis moved about in this vast crowd of courtiers who had to be kept at a respectful distance, but close enough to be under Louis's eye, at Louis's hand, and watching Louis smile. He sacrificed to be who, where, and what he had become. He had stepped back from a woman he truly and dearly loved in his youth to make a political marriage to a Spanish princess. Maria Theresa was the King of Spain's eldest daughter. She had renounced her claim to the Spanish throne and promised a fabulous dowry to marry Louis. She loved him, thought herself not pretty enough or smart enough for him. He treated her with great courtesy, attention, and affection. Over the long course of his long life, he took numerous lovers and had a select cadre of longtime mistresses. And we moderns tend to sort of look askance at his open and secret promiscuity, but we've got marriages for love, and what Louis had was marriages that were aligned along the European style of marriage for connection in 17th century Europe. He was unfailingly courteous to all women. He was known to ceremonially doff his hat at any woman, even passing servant women, in the halls and staircases of Versailles. His life as king was so far removed from our modern sensibilities and sensitivities that we have a hard time understanding Louis XIV. And to do that, I'd like to recommend one particular movie, besides The Musketeers and En Masse. I'd like you to watch Vatel. It's PG-13, so be careful what you see, but it has Julian Sand as maybe the most perfect Louis you'll ever seen. And it presents Colbert and Condé too, shows the ways and means of how a court worked. But you need to watch the very careful presentation of Louis's younger brother Philippe, who was not his twin, but wore a mask much more confined than anything made of iron. But watch especially those courtiers who are often called to be effete and effeminate, who were in truth hard, fast, brave, and killing gentlemen. I'd like you to also look at the Google Art Project of the Palace of Versailles, which gives you a tour of the inside and outside of Versailles beyond your going there through the power of your computer in your home or in your classroom. Now, this short and perhaps oversimplified snapshot of the famous king is more French-friendly than you're normally going to get. But hopefully that prepares you for the next wave, next exploration of Louis XIV within a greater European and American context. And next time I see you, we'll be reconsidering the 17th and 18th centuries as the age of Louis XIV. Thank you.
Well, we've just learned a lot about France and the age of Louis XIV. When we come back for our next lecture, we'll pick up around the Glorious Revolution, which actually occurred in England with the Stuart dynasty. We'll pick up there, all the way up until the Treaty of Utrecht, which ended that Spanish succession war that took place with Louis XIV. Until next time.